In December 2009, I lived alone in a small house in New York City, tucked into a gritty neighborhood that wasn't known as the safest. It was the type of place where you heard car alarms blare through the night, and sometimes the distant echo of shouting would break through the walls. I had just moved there a few months prior for work and was still adjusting to living alone, especially in such a rough area. My house was a small, old building that creaked constantly, making it difficult to sleep some nights, but I had gotten used to it, or at least tried to convince myself I had. My only comfort was the friendly couple that lived next door. They were a young, newlywed pair, always cheerful, and though we only exchanged pleasantries, they made the building feel a bit warmer. Just as winter began to settle in, they left for a holiday trip, mentioning they'd be back in a couple of weeks. They left the lights off in their place, and as the days went by, I began to feel just how alone I was. One Friday night, I came back late from work. It was just past 9 p.m., and the streets were quieter than usual, the kind of quiet that was almost too thick. As I approached my building, I noticed a van parked outside, right in front of my neighbor's door. It wasn't a moving van or a regular delivery van. This one was dark and a bit rusty with no business markings. It seemed strange, but I brushed it off. After all, this was New York. People and vans were everywhere. I entered my house, locked the door, and pushed a chair against it, as I usually did, just to be safe. That was my routine. I ate a quick dinner and settled in with a book, hoping to relax before bed. Around 3 a.m., I was in a light sleep when a loud noise jerked me awake. It was the sound of something breaking, glass maybe, coming from outside. I sat up, my heart pounding, and tried to convince myself it was just another city sound. But then I heard it again, clearer this time, like someone was snapping something. It was followed by a muffled shuffling noise. Curiosity and a strange feeling of dread pulled me toward the window. I slowly lifted the edge of the curtain and peered out. At first, I couldn't make out anything. The street was bathed in dim yellow light from the street lamp, and all was quiet. Then I spotted him. A figure stood near the steps of my neighbor's house. He was tall and wearing a dark hoodie, the hood pulled low over his face. His stance was still, like he was waiting for something. His face was in shadow, but I could feel his presence as if he were somehow aware of me watching. My heart raced as I watched him. I was terrified but couldn't tear myself away from the window. He shifted slightly, and I noticed that he was holding something, though I couldn't make out what. I realized that I needed to do something. I couldn't just sit and watch this happen. It felt wrong and threatening, and the silence of the street only amplified the danger. I grabbed my phone and, with shaking hands, dialed 911. The dispatcher answered, and I tried to keep my voice low as I explained the situation, describing the man and the sounds I'd heard. The dispatcher assured me that officers were on their way, and I clung to the phone as if it were a lifeline, keeping my gaze fixed on the man outside. Minutes passed like hours. The figure remained by my neighbor's door, occasionally glancing around but mostly fixated on the lock. Finally, I heard the faint sound of police sirens in the distance. The man must have heard it too, because he suddenly looked up, alarmed, and bolted toward the dark alley beside the building. 2 police cars pulled up just as he started to run. One officer jumped out and sprinted after him, while the other approached the building. I watched through the window, my breath fogging up the glass, as I felt a mix of relief and fear. After what seemed like a long few minutes, I saw the officers returning, this time with the man in custody. He was handcuffed and scowling as they led him back to the patrol car. I felt a strange sense of accomplishment and guilt at the same time. What if he wasn't trying to break in? What if I'd been wrong? The officer I'd spoken to on the phone eventually knocked on my door. I hesitated before answering, my nerves still raw. When I opened the door, he assured me I'd done the right thing by calling them. He didn't tell me much about who the man was or what his intentions might have been, just that they'd questioned him and that he was someone they had dealt with before. It wasn't exactly reassuring, but it was something. The next morning, I called my neighbors to let them know what had happened. They sounded shaken and thanked me profusely for watching out for their place. They told me they'd be cutting their trip short and coming back sooner than planned. For the next few nights, I barely slept. Every creak in my house felt amplified, each sound outside sending my nerves into a spiral. I found myself looking out the window constantly, expecting to see that figure lurking nearby again. Even though he was gone, his presence seemed to linger, a haunting reminder of how vulnerable I was in that big, indifferent city. When my neighbors returned, they brought over a small gift and thanked me again. But from that night onward, I always kept my door double locked and pushed that chair firmly against it, as if it could keep the darkness of the city at bay. I never saw the man again. My name is Kevin, and this happened when I was 16 years old. It was a cold Friday night in October, and the leaves were starting to fall, leaving the trees bare and casting long shadows in the dim streetlights. My friend Danny and I decided to watch a new horror movie at the local theater. The movie was intense, and by the time it ended, my heart was still racing from all the jump scares. As we left the theater, the clock struck 10 p.m. It was late, and the streets were quiet, almost too quiet. We walked down the main road, making our way back to our neighborhood. The usual hustle and bustle of the town seemed to vanish, leaving only the sounds of our footsteps echoing against the pavement. The chilly breeze made everything feel even lonelier, and I tugged my hoodie tighter around me, feeling the silence press in. Danny, usually chatty, was quiet too, as if he could sense something strange in the air. Then, out of nowhere, we heard footsteps behind us, faint at first, but growing louder. Danny and I slowed down, turning slightly to glance over our shoulders. A man was walking a little distance behind us, his face partly hidden in the shadows. He looked down at his phone, the blue light of the screen briefly illuminating his face. I didn't recognize him, but something about his presence felt off. We tried to brush it off, picking up our pace, but every time we turned a corner, the man seemed to follow. The closer we got to our neighborhood, the more uneasy I felt. There was no one else around, just the sound of our quickening footsteps and the echo of his boots hitting the ground behind us. When we turned again, we saw him in the shadows, still following. But this time, his pace had quickened, and he was now jogging toward us. Panic started to bubble up inside me. I didn't know what this guy wanted, but I had a terrible feeling it wasn't good. The street was dark, and the houses on this block were spaced far apart, with most of them having their lights off. We didn't want to go straight home and risk leading this stranger there. Danny glanced at me, his eyes wide with the same fear I felt, and we both broke into a run. As we sprinted down the empty street, I could hear the man's footsteps picking up speed behind us. I tried to keep my breathing steady, but my heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears. The distance between us and the man was shrinking, and in the dim streetlight I could just make out a glint of something metallic in his hand. A flash of fear jolted through me when I realized he was holding a knife. There was no time to think. Our houses were too far away, so we had to find another option. Desperately scanning our surroundings, I spotted a patch of thick bushes off to the side of the road. I grabbed Danny's arm, and we ducked behind them, crouching down as low as we could. We held our breaths, trying not to make a sound as the footsteps grew louder and closer. I could feel my body tense, every muscle on edge, waiting and hoping that he would pass by without noticing us. But he didn't. The footsteps stopped just in front of the bushes, and through the branches, I could see his figure looming, scanning the area like he was looking for something or someone. My heart was pounding so loud I was sure he could hear it. Slowly, he lifted the knife, holding it in front of him as he leaned closer to the bushes. A surge of fear rushed through me, and I instinctively reached into my pocket, remembering my old phone. I dialed the police, trying to keep my movements as quiet as possible. My hands were shaking so badly that I almost dropped the phone, but I managed to press it close to my mouth and whisper our location. The police dispatcher's voice was calm, telling me to stay hidden and keep quiet. She assured me that officers were on their way. Those few minutes felt like hours. The man was circling the bushes, and I could see the faint gleam of the knife in his hand. He muttered something to himself, his voice low and strange, but I couldn't make out the words. Every second he lingered felt like a lifetime, and I was sure he'd find us. Danny was beside me, barely breathing, his eyes fixed on the man as we waited in silence, hoping and praying he would move on. Then in the distance I heard the faint sound of sirens cutting through the night air. The man heard it too. His head jerked up, and for a split second he froze, looking around as if deciding whether to run. The sirens grew louder, and in a flash he turned and bolted down the street, disappearing into the shadows. Seconds later, the police arrived. Danny and I stumbled out of the bushes, both of us still shaking from the encounter. The officers approached us, asking questions and taking down details. I tried to explain everything: the man's face, the knife, the way he had followed us for blocks. The officers assured us they would patrol the area and try to find him. After what felt like an eternity, they found the man hiding a few streets over. The police told us later that he was a known criminal and had been wanted for attempted kidnapping. It turned out we had narrowly escaped a dangerous encounter, one that could have ended in a way I don't even want to imagine. That night changed me. It reminded me that danger can come out of nowhere, and sometimes just being in the wrong place at the wrong time can put you in a situation you never saw coming. But I was lucky. Danny and I made it out safe, and that's something I'll never take for granted. I'd heard the stories about the old Jackson house since I was a kid, an abandoned relic of the 1800s hidden deep in the pine woods of East Texas, where trees seemed to reach for you and branches tangled together like a web, blocking most of the sunlight. They said no one had lived there since the last Jackson died over 50 years ago. Local kids whispered that the place was haunted, filled with ghosts of the Jacksons, or worse, things that no one could name. I never believed the tales, not really. I was older now, in my 20s, and after a few beers on a dull Friday night, my buddies and I decided we'd go check it out for ourselves. They dared me mostly, but a part of me wanted to know just for once what all the fuss was about. By the time we reached the place, it was already past midnight. The drive had taken longer than I expected, and we had to park on the dirt road and walk through the woods. As we got closer, I could see the Jackson house looming ahead, barely lit by the moon filtering through the branches. It looked like a crumbling monument with its cracked paint, sagging roof, and broken windows that stared like hollow eyes. We climbed the porch steps, which groaned under our weight, and pushed open the front door. Inside, the air was thick, like the house was breathing its stale dust. Shadows stretched across the walls, cast by our flashlights, making shapes that twisted and curled with each step. There was an eerie silence, not a single sound except our feet on the creaking floorboards. My friends Mike and Todd were with me, but they were strangely quiet. I could tell that they were regretting the dare, though neither would admit it. We walked into what must have been the living room, an open space with faded wallpaper peeling from the walls. A worn-out couch sat in the corner, its fabric torn and stained. An old piano stood by the far wall, its keys cracked and yellowed. It looked as if someone had left in a hurry, leaving everything just as it was. I wanted to laugh at how ordinary it all seemed. Haunted? No way. Just another sad, abandoned house. I turned to say something to Mike, but he was staring at something behind me, his face pale and his eyes wide. I followed his gaze, turning slowly. In the corner of the room, where the shadows were darkest, stood a figure. At first I thought it was just another trick of the light, a pile of clothes or a curtain blowing in some hidden draught. But the longer I looked, the more I realized that it was shaped like a man, tall, with broad shoulders. And yet, the figure seemed to melt into the darkness, its edges blurred almost like smoke. It was standing so still, too still, and I felt this sinking, awful certainty that it was looking right at me. "Do you see that?" Mike whispered, his voice barely audible. I nodded, unable to speak. The air felt heavier, pressing down on us, thick and suffocating. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, like it was waiting, watching. My flashlight was still pointed toward it, but it barely seemed to cut through the darkness around the shape. It was as if the shadow had weight, a thickness that swallowed the light. Todd, who had been quiet the whole time, took a step forward, trying to get a better look. I wanted to grab him and pull him back, but I couldn't move. I couldn't take my eyes off that figure. It felt wrong, unnatural, as though it was something that shouldn't exist in the same world as us. Todd stopped, and for a moment, we all just stood there frozen, staring at the figure. Then, in a slow, deliberate motion, the shadowy man seemed to turn, as though it was shifting to look at Todd. I swear I saw a glint of something in what might have been its eyes, a flash of something cold and distant. Todd stumbled backward, nearly tripping over himself as he scrambled to get away. "Let's go," he muttered, his voice shaking. "Let's get out of here." We didn't argue. We backed out of the room, not daring to turn our backs on that shadow. I felt like if I looked away, even for a second, it would get closer, like it would reach out of the darkness and grab me. We hurried down the hallway, our footsteps echoing through the house. The walls seemed to close in, the shadows thickening as if they wanted to trap us inside. Just as we reached the front door, I dared one last glance behind me. The shadow figure was there, standing at the end of the hallway, its form barely visible in the dark. It was closer than before, much closer, almost like it had followed us. I didn't look back again. We ran out of that house, stumbling over the rotting porch steps and sprinting through the woods until we reached the car. None of us said a word on the drive back, our minds struggling to understand what we had just seen. I don't go near the Jackson house anymore. None of us do. People still talk about it, of course, but I keep quiet.